Well, it's 11:29 p.m. and I think I potentially could be filming the most important video I've ever filmed. Tonight I'm out on the Canon R6II, the Panasonic Lumix S5IIx and the Nikon Z6III. All 24 megapixel cameras and all fit in the absolute middle of the range for these three companies. And I'm going to put them head to head, and I'm going to make quite a number of videos about these three cameras because I think they're very important to each of the brands. And with all of them, I'm going to be shooting with their standard 50mm 1.8. That seems to be a real equalizer and the sort of lens that many people would purchase. Let's start by looking at some comparisons of images. There's the Nikon, there's the Lumix, and there is the Canon. And you can also see the lenses that we're using, the 51.8, the 50S, and the 51.8 STM, the RF from Canon. Now we can see, interestingly, that there's slightly different resolutions. The Canon and the Lumix are 6000 by 4000 and the Nikon is 6048 by 4032. Is that going to make any difference in the real world? No, none at all. Alright, let's start by just zooming in on probably the first thing that I noticed, which was in this corner here. And if we go to 100%, I just want to talk about these 50mm lenses. This is a standard ubiquitous lens, the sort of lens that someone will purchase as a bit of a catch-all lens, usually the most affordable quality prime lens, and all three manufacturers make this 50mm 1.8. The Nikon is the most expensive, the Panasonic is the next most expensive, and the Canon is the most affordable. And quite frankly, across all these images, we will find that you're actually getting what you're paying for here, and we can see it straight away in the corner of this image and how it's handling, well, how it's handling chromatic aberration, purple fringing, and also this flaring distortion that's going on here in the corner. There's plenty going on with this word afloat, and also if you look at the lights that we can see here, there's a very, very different reaction to the lights. And if we look at these images out of the corner, yeah, they look pretty similar. I'm pretty okay because we're pixel for pixel, we're 100%, and I think we could say that the Nikon is the sharpest. If we look at those palm fronds there, it's certainly sharper than the Canon. And if we look at how it's dealing with these lights in the background, Canon is certainly not doing the best job when it comes to chromatic aberration, and the Lumix and the Nikon are doing a far better job. And just to go back over here, quite a big distance between that palm tree and this logo, but definitely in the corners, the Canon does not appear to be hanging together. And if we look at the sharpness here on this plant, definitely the Nikon appears to be the sharpest. And these are all shot at 1.8. You can see the metadata below each image. Obviously the plan was to make the metadata the same, and also the other plan, just so you know, is to make all of these settings, everything, color, temperature, exposure, shadows, everything about these images is the same except for the ICC profile, which Capture One automatically adds to them. Now what we could do is make them all generic and see how that changes things. That hardly changed anything at all. So really interesting to see what you definitely get what you pay for when it comes to the lens. If we have a look in here at these lights, and we'll just get those a bit lined up. The other thing that's quite interesting about these lenses is the field of view is different. It's quite different between them. You don't really notice it that much when it's zoomed out, but you do when it's zoomed in. Just have a look at how the purple fringing and the relative sharpness of pixels, it's quite different. Now, of course, RAW files and RAW converters, well, they're all different. And the way that these files might be being sharpened is also potentially different. Which is strange, the notion that the RAW file is pre-sharpened, but it might be being sharpened actually by Capture One, as it does its process of converting the raw information into what we see here today. But there is quite a bit of a difference. And one other fundamental difference between these three cameras, which I will change next time I go out, is the Z6 is shooting in high efficiency star, which is actually a highly compressed format. It's a lossless compressed format, but it's still compressed. The files are around 60% of the normal size, whereas both of the other two cameras are running at their normal RAW files. And, you know, you never know. That might make a difference in what we're seeing here. It's hard to know, but it certainly wouldn't make a difference when it comes to how the lens is performing, but it would make a difference as to how the pixels are performing, potentially. I've never really noticed a difference between high efficiency star and Nikon's standard raw file format. When we compare with other brands, absolutely that's where we're going to see some differences. There's that first file. There's some of the things that I saw. And if you have a look at the width of the frame, you can see that the Canon and the Lumix are a smidge wider than the Nikon Z. And I don't know how these manufacturers make 50mm lenses, which you'd think would be a standard, yet they're different. I wonder which one's closest. Have had to stop for a drink because it's basically midnight and it's still 29 degrees Celsius here in Melbourne. We're going through a bit of a heat wave at this time of year, and we're getting 3 or 4 days at almost 40 degrees Celsius. That's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's quite epic here at midnight. It's hotter than most summer's days. Check out my cameras. Good. 24 times 3. What's that, everybody? Yes, 72. Well done. Yeah, so what I'm trying to do here is create separation between the foreground and the background so we can see how these lenses work when it comes to bokeh. I'll do a more extreme version at some point, but this will just get us started. So that's done. We're shooting 1/4 of a second, 1/8 ISO 100. That's that one. Now we'll go over to the Canon. Oh, yeah, no, it's a lot darker. That's really interesting. I'm sure the raw files will be similar. Alright, that's that one. It's quite interesting remembering where all these power buttons are. They're all in different places on all these cameras. And man, the EVFs are different, and the controls, the placement of menu buttons and play buttons, nothing is similar, really. But what matters at the end of the day is how do those files look. That's it, we're done. Nikon at the top left, the Lumix top right, and the Canon bottom left. One thing I think important to point out is that the Nikon 50mm 1.8 did not have its lens hood on. The Panasonic did, the Canon did not. All these files look pretty damn fantastic. Obviously there is a lot going on. This is a bit of a background bokeh test along with aberration tests. Plus the way I'm able to shoot with Nikon cameras is I can shoot for the highlights and I can pull up the shadow areas a long way. Often 3 to 5 stops, anywhere in there is not really a problem. And we are shooting at base ISO on all of these cameras. In theory, it shouldn't be a problem, but I've never shot with a Canon DSLR or mirrorless camera. Let's start by looking in these shadow areas here. Now, this is 100%, and we can clearly see, and I've only pushed these 2 stops. If you have a look on the top left there where it says exposure, 2 stops, 2 stops, 2 stops. We can clearly see more noise starting to appear in the Canon. If you wanted to push it 3 stops, then it becomes a lot more obvious. I'll just pop those all to 3 stops. The Z6III, there's been a lot of noise, every pun intended, around how its sensor performs. Yet here we see it slightly noisier when pushed 3 stops than the Lumix, just slightly. But of course, let's remember that the Z6III has this partially stacked or semi-stacked sensor, which allows it to do things that neither of these other cameras can do with its electronic shutter and far less rolling shutter when it comes to video, along with the acquisition of focus being quicker because the sensor's quicker. There's a whole lot of knock-on effects for having this much faster sensor. So I would say the performance between the Lumix and the Nikon, pretty close. Lumix is doing just slightly better with this noise, but then we look at the Canon and, well, there's been some pundits out there, large channels, that have the capacity to have access to every camera on the market. I've never used the Canon before. This is the first time I've put these three cameras together in the same space, shooting the same thing, framing up the same thing, and I'm surprised. Unless there's something that I'm missing, and please do let me know if there's something that I'm missing here in regards to how this is being processed. This is in Capture One. I am doing nothing extra. There is no adjustments of noise. I'm just doing what Capture One does when you import, and this is the results that I'm getting at 100 ISO when pushing 3 stops. I can clearly see that I'm very comfortable with how the Lumix and the Nikon are looking. Nikon, Lumix, Canon. So there you go, noise. Now, I will do further testing with this. I'm not saying this is a definitive outcome, but I am a little bit surprised. I'll show you where I was focusing. It was on this fence here. I think we can say again that the Lumix and the Nikon are definitely the sharpest two, and the Canon appears to be less sharp. Now, I took 3 or 4 images of each of these to try and ensure they were sharp. You always have to take into account with these sorts of things, is there a chance that something went wrong with the test? Again, I do think this is an example of you get what you pay for. The Canon is the most affordable lens and the Nikon is the least affordable. It's also the one that I think is performing the best. So you've just got to decide what works for you. Now, as we get this fall off here, we can already see there's a difference in contrast. I also think there is a difference in fussiness, but also we can see here the way that the Nikon is handling the green fringing appears to be better suppressed, not completely suppressed, but better suppressed. And personally, when we're looking at this bokeh, I prefer how the Nikon is handling it. It appears to be the softest and the least fussy. So that's interesting. Nikon's lenses have sometimes been accused of being too clinical, but when I look at these 3 outcomes here, I would say that is absolutely not the case. It's the opposite. So that's really interesting. Now, as I often say, there's no bad bokeh. Bokeh is just different. But for me, for softness, creaminess, fall off, roll off, I'm liking the Lumix and the Nikon the best of these 3. Otherwise, if you look at these images like this, and this is how a lot of people will view these types of images, they look very similar. And it's great to see color temperature wise, detail wise, overall image wise, very similar. And as I said before, the only thing I'm a bit confused by is how the size of the frames are, well, quite different. And I think what's most interesting here, this is a test of how these lenses handle this really bright light. So let's just go straight on in and have a look. And, well, I think it's all pretty self-evident there. The differences in the purple fringing are obvious with the Canon, and the Lumix and the Nikon are hanging together pretty similarly. I do think that the Nikon is taking that by a hair. Now, purple fringing is something that's correctable. A lot of these things are kind of correctable. It's up to you how much you worry about it. It's interesting to look at how the Nikon is dealing with this edge here. It seems to be smoother than definitely how the Lumix is dealing with it. Again, those background areas, I definitely prefer what the Z50mm is doing. A little bit of a look at green fringing. The Z has a little bit of green fringing, but it appears to have the least of the 3 of these lenses. 12:23 a.m. past midnight, looking at these 3 cameras for the first time, the Canon, the Lumix and the Nikon. What are the differences? I think it's going to be really interesting to see the differences in how lenses work and the differences in how the sensors work, because we know Canon make their own sensors, and as for Panasonic and Nikon, well,
Most people think they're some sort of Sony derivative. That may well be the case. Anyway, I think it's really interesting. I'd love to know your thoughts. More importantly, what do you think when you see all these different files? In upcoming videos, we're going to go into way more detail, way more depth, but I just wanted to get, basically this video was about me getting a sense of how all these cameras function, as well as what to expect from the files, and then that gives me a more informed position to go on to make more complex videos. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again, and please leave some comments below. All right, see ya.